In the summer of 2011, Robyn Gardner was at a crossroads. At 35, she lived in Frederick, Maryland, and to most who knew her, she was vibrant, sociable, and always looking for her next adventure. But beneath that exterior, she was navigating tension. She had been dating Richard Forrester, a steady man who cared for her deeply, but their relationship had its cracks. The two had recently argued, and Robyn seemed to be searching for space, an escape, something new, something far from Maryland. That opportunity came in the form of Giordano, a man she had known casually for a short time. Giordano was 50, a businessman from Maryland with a reputation for being controlling and boastful. Friends would later question why Robyn agreed to travel with him, but in early August 2011, she accepted his invitation to Aruba, a Caribbean island famed for turquoise waters and endless sun. It would be a trip that appeared on the surface to promise relaxation. But in hindsight, it marked the beginning of a nightmare. Aruba, for Americans, carried a darker weight in memory. Just 6 years earlier, in 2005, Natalee Holloway had vanished there without a trace. Her case remained unsolved, her name still tied to the island. When Robyn and Gary landed in Aruba on August 1st, that history lingered like a shadow. At first, the trip appeared ordinary. The two checked into a local hotel and moved through the island's tourist circuit. They dined at restaurants, were seen by locals at bars, and mingled in Aruba's easygoing nightlife. Yet to those who observed them, something seemed off. Robyn was polite but subdued, while Gary carried himself with a kind of restless energy, constantly dominating conversations. Back home in Maryland, Robyn's sudden departure had left Richard Forrester confused and hurt. She had not told him about traveling with Gary. Their communication in those days before her disappearance was strained, marked by silence and unanswered calls. It was a fracture that would soon widen into permanent loss. Robyn herself seemed conflicted during those early days in Aruba. She posted updates on social media but kept them vague, as though she was curating the image of a tropical getaway without giving away much about her companion. To friends who knew her well, those posts felt oddly restrained, lacking her usual warmth. Gary, on the other hand, left a stronger impression. He was seen repeatedly speaking for Robyn, ordering for her at restaurants, and inserting himself into conversations. Waitstaff at one establishment later described him as overbearing, while Robyn appeared quiet, almost withdrawn. If the trip had been intended as a carefree escape, it was not unfolding that way. Still, on the surface, the pair continued moving through the island like tourists. They visited the southern parts of Aruba, a place less crowded by resorts, more defined by open stretches of coastline. And on the morning of August 2nd, Gary suggested they head toward a spot known as Baby Beach, a scenic but relatively isolated bay at the southeastern tip of the island. It was here, in this setting, that the course of the trip took its fatal turn. The beach itself is shaped like a crescent, bordered by calm, shallow water that slowly opens into deeper currents. Families often swim there safely, though locals know the surrounding ocean can turn treacherous if one ventures too far out. Gary later claimed that he and Robyn chose that morning to snorkel there together. According to him, Robyn waded into the water, mask and gear in place, while he kept an eye on her. Moments later, he said, she vanished, swept out, gone without a sound. But even at this earliest stage, something about his account did not sit right. Baby Beach was not known for sudden riptides, and Robyn, by the accounts of friends and family, was not comfortable with snorkeling. She had a fear of deep water and avoided activities that carried risk. Why she would have agreed to snorkel that day, in a spot so unfamiliar, raised immediate doubts. Still, in those final visible hours, the only narrative came from Gary. There were no other confirmed witnesses to Robyn's presence at Baby Beach. No locals recalled seeing her in snorkel gear. The only evidence of that morning rests in Gary's testimony. By the afternoon, Gary reported Robyn missing. He contacted authorities, explaining that she had been lost at sea. Within hours, police began questioning him, a decision accelerated by the context. Aruba, scarred by Natalee Holloway's disappearance years earlier, was not willing to treat another missing American as routine. the news traveled quickly back to Maryland. Robyn's family was blindsided. Richard Forrester, her boyfriend, learned of her disappearance not from Robyn herself, but through reports that she was missing in Aruba with another man. The shock was double. Not only was she gone, but she had been with Giordano, someone Richard had never been told about. That Tuesday evening, August 2nd, as the Caribbean sun dipped over the water, the search for Robyn began. Local authorities, aware of the island's reputation and the potential media storm, dispatched boats, divers, and helicopters. But even in the earliest hours, they faced a haunting reality. Robyn seemed to have vanished entirely, with no trace in the sand, the sea, or the surf. It was the beginning of a case that would quickly spiral into suspicion, controversy, and enduring mystery. You're watching Trace of Evil, where we reveal true crimes, unsolved disappearances, and mysteries surrounding crime. Like and subscribe to watch more episodes from our channel. Let's get back into the story of Robyn Gardner. When Giordano reported Robyn Gardner missing on August 2nd, 2011, he framed it as a tragic accident. According to him, the two had gone snorkeling at Baby Beach, and Robyn had been pulled away by currents while he surfaced for air. By the time he looked back, she was gone. To the untrained ear, it sounded plausible enough, but when investigators dug deeper, the details began to unravel. For one, the conditions at Baby Beach that day were calm. The lagoon is well known among Aruban locals as one of the safest spots on the island. The only danger lies beyond the shallow crescent, where the reef opens to the sea. But witnesses insisted they never saw Robyn in the water. No discarded snorkel gear was found. No footprints traced from their rented vehicle to the shore. For a woman to vanish without leaving even a sandal or a towel seemed unusual. Gary's own demeanor also drew suspicion. Within hours of reporting Robyn missing, police noted he appeared frustrated rather than devastated. He pressed them about when he could leave the island, asking logistical questions about flights. His answers about Robyn's background were vague, as though he didn't know much about the woman he had traveled with. The more authorities pressed, the more contradictions surfaced. Gary first claimed they had been snorkeling side by side. Later, he shifted, saying she was trailing behind him and that he lost sight of her. He described diving down and searching frantically, but when investigators checked his body, there were no signs of exertion. No scratches from coral, no sunburn from extended time in the water, no wet gear that matched his description. Meanwhile, in Maryland, Robyn's disappearance hit the news, and the contradictions spilled into the public. Richard Forrester, still reeling from learning Robyn had gone to Aruba with Gary, expressed his disbelief. He knew Robyn feared the water. She had once confided that snorkeling made her uncomfortable. To him, the idea that she willingly geared up to explore Baby Beach felt impossible. The discrepancies only mounted. Gary told police Robyn had worn snorkel fins, but none were recovered. He said she brought her own gear, but her luggage contained none. And while Gary claimed to have been focused on saving her, cell phone records painted a colder picture. In the window of time she supposedly vanished, he made multiple calls and sent text messages, including one reportedly to a contact in the United States. Investigators, already wary of Aruba's past with the Natalee Holloway case, tightened their grip. They questioned Gary extensively, and each session widened the cracks. His behavior shifted from cooperative to defensive. He hired a local attorney quickly, even before Robyn's family could arrive on the island. But the most alarming revelation came from his past. As detectives dug into his background, they discovered Giordano had a history of suspicious behavior with women. He had faced accusations in the US of stalking and harassment. More disturbingly, he had previously taken out insurance policies on female companions before traveling with them. In Robyn's case, investigators found evidence of a $1.5 million accidental death policy in which Gary was the beneficiary. This detail transformed the investigation. What began as a presumed accident was now under the lens of potential premeditation. The possibility that Gary had planned this trip not as a vacation, but as a financial scheme, jolted the case into international headlines. Back in the US, Robyn's family was devastated. Her mother and brother flew to Aruba, desperate for answers. They were met with sympathetic locals, but the evidence remained elusive. The search efforts, helicopters, divers, dogs, and Coast Guard boats, turned up nothing. The Caribbean waters, so clear and shallow near Baby Beach, yielded no trace of Robyn's body. The absence of physical evidence complicated the case. There was no proof she had drowned, no proof she had ever entered the water that day. But the growing weight of circumstantial evidence pressed heavily against Gary. Police detained him as a suspect, holding him under Aruban law while they continued their search. In press conferences, authorities stressed their caution. They did not want another international embarrassment like the Holloway case, where perceived mishandling drew global outrage. But this caution also meant Gary's rights were preserved carefully. He denied wrongdoing at every turn, insisting he was being scapegoated because of Aruba's past reputation. Yet his actions told a different story. He resisted cooperation with Robyn's family. He gave no emotional statements about wanting her found. Instead, his words circled back to his own predicament. His detention, his reputation, his claims of innocence. To many watching, it was as if Robyn herself had become secondary in his narrative. By mid-August, 2 weeks after her disappearance, the search began winding down. Officials admitted publicly that they had found no trace of her in the sea or on land. But with each dead end, suspicion around Gary only deepened. He had placed himself as the last person to see her alive, and every attempt to explain her absence fractured under scrutiny. When Aruban police detained Gary Giordano in the days following Robyn Gardner's disappearance, they knew the move was controversial. Holding an American citizen in a high-profile case risked igniting diplomatic tension, but the circumstances demanded scrutiny. Giordano was the last person to see Robyn alive. His story was riddled with inconsistencies, and the $1.5 million insurance policy naming him as beneficiary looked like a motive written in ink. Gary was taken to Kia Prison in Aruba, a stark contrast to the luxurious resorts nearby. There, investigators pressed him with long interviews, seeking cracks in his narrative. He repeated his snorkeling story, sometimes word for word, other times with small shifts that raised eyebrows. To detectives, it sounded rehearsed, less like a recollection and more like a shield. One of the first contradictions they noted was his description of the beach. At one point, he insisted the current had been strong, dragging Robyn away in seconds. Yet weather data and diver reports confirmed Baby Beach was calm that afternoon. Later, he claimed she had wanted to push herself to overcome her fear of snorkeling, but friends back in Maryland disputed that, saying Robyn had long avoided deep water. The narrative bent under scrutiny. The insurance revelation cast the heaviest shadow. Authorities learned Giordano had signed the policy shortly before the trip, and it covered accidental death in foreign countries, a detail almost too specific to ignore. Prosecutors suspected premeditation, that Gary had brought Robyn to Aruba with the intent of profiting from her death. It was a theory chilling in its simplicity, but difficult to prove without physical evidence. While Gary sat in custody, the search for Robyn continued across the island and surrounding waters. Helicopters scanned the coastline, divers combed reefs, and dogs swept the inland terrain. But no sign of Robyn emerged. The sea yielded no body, no clothing, no snorkel equipment. Forensic teams scoured Gary's rental car and hotel room. They found traces of female DNA, but nothing conclusive, nothing they could match to violence. The FBI, aware of the insurance policy, opened their own investigation stateside. They combed through Giordano's financial history, tracking patterns of behavior. What they uncovered was unsettling. He had a track record of questionable relationships with women, several of whom later filed complaints of harassment or stalking. Investigators suspected Robyn was not the first woman he had tried to manipulate, though perhaps the first whose story ended in disappearance. The media seized on every revelation. Headlines in the U.S. screamed of another woman gone missing in Aruba, drawing immediate comparisons to Natalee Holloway. Television pundits dissected Gary's demeanor, his refusal to make emotional appeals for Robyn's return, and his insistence that he was a victim of paranoia against foreigners. The island, once marketed as a safe paradise, was once again the stage of global scrutiny. Meanwhile, Robyn's family traveled to Aruba, devastated but determined. They met with local officials, pleaded for more searches, and demanded answers from Gary. He avoided them, shielded by lawyers, never offering condolences or comfort. To them, it was proof enough of his guilt. Robyn's boyfriend, Richard Forrester, gave tearful interviews, his anguish palpable as he described the pain of not knowing whether she was alive or dead. Aruban prosecutors faced pressure from all sides. They knew the world was watching, but their hands were tied by the limitations of their legal system. To formally charge Giordano, they needed solid evidence, a body, forensic proof, or a confession. Without it, they risked their case collapsing under scrutiny in court. Yet releasing him risked backlash from Robyn's family and the international press. Giordano's attorneys played aggressively. They framed his detention as unlawful, arguing there was no evidence a crime had been committed. They claimed Aruba, still haunted by the Holloway case, had rushed to judgment. They painted him as a scapegoat trapped in a cycle of suspicion, insisting Robyn's disappearance was nothing more than a tragic accident. The stalemate dragged on. Gary remained in detention for nearly 3 months as investigators combed through every lead. They traced his steps in the days before Robyn vanished, questioning restaurant staff, hotel workers, and anyone who might have seen them together. Some remembered seeing them at lunch, Robyn appearing quiet, Gary more animated. Others noted tension, as if an argument had simmered beneath the surface. Despite these fragments, no witness could place Robyn at Baby Beach that day. Not one person recalled seeing her enter the water. This gap in the timeline became central to the prosecution's suspicions. If she never went snorkeling, then Gary's story was false. But proving what did happen remained elusive. As weeks turned into months, pressure mounted. The Aruban government could not justify indefinite detention without charges. In November 2011, despite fierce protest from Robyn's family, authorities released Gary Giordano due to insufficient evidence. He boarded a plane back to the United States, a free man. Legally, but under a cloud of suspicion so heavy it would never lift. The release was a devastating blow for Robyn's loved ones. For them, it confirmed what they feared most, that justice would remain out of reach. The investigation had painted Gary as the prime suspect, but without Robyn's body, there was no case that could hold in court. By the time the months dragged on after Robyn Gardner's disappearance, the case had become a frustrating symbol of how justice can falter, even when suspicion appears obvious. Gary Giordano had been the last person seen with her, the man who reported her missing, and the figure who seemed to stand at the very center of the mystery. Yet, despite the mounting concerns from investigators and the public, he walked free. Aruban authorities had held Giordano for more than 2 months after Robyn vanished. Their suspicion was bolstered by his strange behavior, his shifting stories, and most importantly, the revelation of a $1.5 million accidental death insurance policy that listed Giordano as the beneficiary. To investigators, this was no coincidence. The idea that a woman could go missing under his watch, only to later find that he would profit significantly from her death, was deeply troubling. Still, suspicion was not evidence. Authorities scoured the beaches, the waters, and the rugged coastline near Baby Beach. They brought in divers, dogs, and helicopters. Not a trace of Robyn's body, her clothing, or her belongings was ever found. In the absence of physical proof, prosecutors had no foundation on which to build a case for murder. With no body, no direct evidence, and only circumstantial suspicion, Giordano was released and allowed to return to the United States. When he landed back home, his behavior stirred even more questions. Instead of retreating quietly, Giordano appeared in interviews, presenting himself as a man wrongfully accused and unfairly maligned by the media. He insisted he had nothing to do with Robyn's disappearance and claimed she had simply vanished while snorkeling. But his explanations often raised more doubts than they answered. His story of the snorkeling trip seemed inconsistent with what investigators knew about Robyn. Her friends insisted she was not a strong swimmer, nor was she likely to venture far into unfamiliar waters. The insurance policy also haunted the case. Though Giordano denied having anything to do with Robyn's disappearance, Many found it impossible to believe that taking out such a large policy before their trip was just a coincidence. Investigators in both Aruba and the US looked into the circumstances, and it emerged that Giordano had a history of taking out similar insurance policies on other women he dated and traveled with. That pattern suggested premeditation, or at the very least, a disturbing level of opportunism. Despite these suspicions, the legal system remained constrained. Without Robyn's body, the Aruban authorities could not prove she was dead, let alone murdered. For Robyn's family, this was the most painful part of the ordeal. They were left in a limbo where their loved one was simply gone, without answers, without justice, and without closure. Her mother and friends described the endless torment of imagining what might have happened, whether she had suffered, whether she had trusted the wrong person, and whether her remains were lying somewhere on the ocean floor, never to be recovered. The parallels to the Natalee Holloway case, which had occurred just 6 years earlier in the very same place, were impossible to ignore. Both women were young Americans who vanished while vacationing in Aruba. Both cases featured a man at the center who was never convicted of a crime. And both ended in heartbreak for families who would never know exactly what happened. These parallels reinforced public perception that Aruba was a dangerous destination where justice for missing women remained elusive. Years later, the case of Robyn Gardner still hangs in the air unresolved. For Gary Giordano, though suspicion still follows him, he was never convicted, and he continues to live freely.